I am Larry Norden from the Brennan Center. Thank you, everyone, for coming out this afternoon. On behalf of the Brennan Center for Justice at NYU Law School, thanks to all of our panelists, who I'm going to introduce in a second. Before we begin, though, I thought I would start with a brief summary of the voting report that we're here to talk about, Voting Machines at Risk, and the looming crisis with aging voting technology. First of all, and we should have, I should say that copies of this report should be here soon. I think they're being delivered to the club and they're a little bit late. First of all, my co-author, Chris Svamageti, is right here up front, and he may have a chance to talk about our findings a little bit as well. The reason that we decided to work on this report was, of course, probably like many of you, we read the Presidential Commission's report on election administration in 2014 with some alarm. For those who haven't read it, the last topic that it covered was aging voting equipment, and it identified that as an impending crisis for the country. And in the months that followed that report, we had a number of conversations with election officials who expressed concern about their aging equipment. But for all of those conversations, and even the Presidential Commission's report, which was excellent, there really hadn't been a comprehensive look at the age of equipment in the United States, or an attempt to quantify the depth of the problem. So using excellent data that we got from Verified Voting, who keeps track of equipment in polling places around the country almost in real time. Sometimes there's a few months lag. We searched public documents, voting machine contracts, other government investigations that we could find, and then interviewed over 100 election officials in all 50 states, as well as independent experts in a variety of fields, and finally voting machine vendors to attempt to paint a more full picture of what the situation with voting equipment in the United States looks like today, and to gauge the depth and the scope of the problem that, at least among election officials, there's been more conversation about. And I have to say, what we found was a problem that was, in many ways, more far-reaching than I expected. Technology experts that we spoke to said that for most systems, components for machines that were purchased since 2000 should have a life expectancy between 10 and 15 years. Obviously, after the 2000 election, there was a huge transformation in the country in the equipment that we were using, and almost everywhere in the country moved to some form of electronic voting machine. So there's that 10 to 15 year period. In 43 states in 2016, states will be using at least some equipment that is at least 10 years old. In 14 states, states will be using equipment that is at least 15 years old. And worse, many states do not seem yet, anyway, prepared to pay for replacement of those systems. There's a lot more in the report about the kinds of problems that this aging equipment creates, and what that can mean for our elections in 2016 and beyond, and some of our thoughts on the way forward. But I'm going to leave that to the discussion, because we do have an exceptional panel to really grapple with these issues. I'm going to give some brief introductions, and then I'm going to turn it over to Pam Fessler, who will moderate the discussion. Pam Fessler is a national correspondent, is a correspondent on NPR's National Desk. She covers poverty and philanthropy, and she is also, without question, one of the nation's leading reporters on election administration and election reform. And for those of us who work in elections, we greatly value her curiosity, her thoroughness, and her ability to explain some of the difficult issues that we work on. We're also joined by two of the nation's leading and most important election officials. To Pam's left is Edgardo Cortez, who is Virginia's first Commissioner of Elections. In that role, he serves as agency head for the Virginia Department of Election and as chief state election official for the Commonwealth of Virginia. To my right on the screen is Neil Kelly, who is the Registrar of Voters for Orange County, California, which is the 5th largest voting jurisdiction in the United States. It serves more than 1.6 million registered voters. And last but certainly not least, on the far left there, my far left, is Doug Lewis, who until this year, for more than 20 years, served as Executive Director of the Elections Center, a nonprofit organization that serves elections and voter registration officials by sponsoring training and certification programs for professional election administration and vendors. Thanks, Pam.
Well, thank you. Welcome, everybody. I really appreciate you all coming for what's the always exciting topic of aging voting equipment. I mentioned to Doug when I saw him that I started covering this in 2000, and the very first story I did was at a press conference on Capitol Hill after the 2000 elections, when Republicans and Democrats had come together and said, this is an incredibly serious problem. We have to make sure this never happens again, and we have to make sure we have the money and that we do something as a nation to address voting equipment and the problems with voting equipment. And here we are 15 years later. And the first person I spoke to was Doug, who either shaped or, as I say, distorted my view for the next 15 years. Anyway, so as Larry mentioned, there's just incredible examples in this report of some of the things that local election officials have encountered, especially in recent years, and what they're anticipating encountering in the coming years. So I would like to kind of start the discussion by speaking with our election officials. And Neil, can you hear me okay?
Yes, Pam.
Great. So can you talk a little bit about, in Orange County, what are some of the things that you have faced or have had to deal with as a local election official with your equipment, and sort of what are some of the accommodations that you've had to make?
So just real quickly, thank you to the Brennan Center for inviting me to be on the panel. I appreciate it very much. And just to give you kind of a perspective of what we're dealing with, we currently have 12,000 pieces of equipment here in Orange County that we purchased and put out in the field in 2004. Out of that 12,000 pieces of equipment, we have 67,000 individual components, and 49,000 of those have moving parts to them. So imagine putting your PC you purchased in 2004 in the trunk of your car in a Samsonite case and carried it around for 10, 11 years and hoped it worked. That's kind of what we're facing. And it's not just wear and tear on the system that we're dealing with on a daily basis, but it's also software components. When you have a certified system that you cannot change, you cannot touch, you have some real challenges there. And I just want to give you one anecdotal story that kind of would hit home. On part of our system, we are required to use Windows 2000. Well, for those of you that are familiar with Microsoft's products, they stopped supporting that in any way, shape, or form in 2010. So as we have issues with laptops or things that come up, we have to go to mom and pop computer shops to find old laptops that have Windows 2000 on them to be able to run some of these programs. Now, I just want to clarify that this is not in the tabulation side. I don't want to cause that kind of an alarm, but it is in resetting voting booths and some of the overall daily operations you have to deal with. But when you're dealing with Windows 2000, what are you going to be doing? And you can't change that system. So that's a good example of some of the issues we're dealing with.
Yeah, and actually one of my favorite examples in the Brennan Center report was from Ken Terry, who was Director of Elections in Allen County, Ohio, and he was talking about how the last presidential election he had to actually find new zip disks for his tabulator, and of course they're not made anymore, and he really struggled to get them. And when he finally got some from the manufacturer, he said there was a coupon in the package that expired in 1999, which I thought was a great example. And
I just want to say something, Pam, because we heard from him, and he said it was so great to be on to have you interview him, because other election officials around the country heard this, and they went into their cabinets and sent him some zip disks. So.
And of course, everybody in my office who is, much, much, much younger than I were like, zip disks? What are those? So one other just sort of follow-up question, Neil. So, at this point, what as you're entering the 2000, getting prepared for the 2016 elections, are you making any changes, or what kind of concerns do you have about the impact on that particular election?
Well, this probably would really hit home with you. I told my folks about 6 months ago that if we had an election tomorrow, I wouldn't be fielding the equipment. I mean, I just want to kind of set the tone for how serious I think this is. But that being said, when we look at the data from 2014, we've done a lot of research and analysis to find out what are the areas in the system that are vulnerable, what are the parts that could fail, not the ones that have failed, but what could fail in the near term. And we've done a very in-depth analysis in that regard. And we have a maintenance project actually that's starting tomorrow. And I like to call it a D check if you compare that to the airline industry, where you completely tear apart an aircraft. That's what we're doing with our system, and it's going to take us about 3 months. And we're replacing parts, this is key, replacing parts that have not failed. And I don't think it's hard for election officials to put their head around the fact that you're going to invest money in something that hasn't been broken yet. And that's the path that we're taking and preparing for 16.
Edgardo, you also in Virginia have faced a number of issues related to equipment. One, you recently decertified equipment that was used in about 20% of the state, I believe, because it was learned that this equipment was hackable. Maybe you can talk a little bit about that, and then what kind of problems that has caused for local election officials in the state.
Sure. Well, thanks again, all of you, for inviting me today. Yes, Virginia has faced a number of voting equipment issues in recent elections. I think last November we had some pretty high-profile issues in Virginia Beach, actually, related to touchscreen equipment and calibration issues that were resulting in people trying to select a candidate and not being able to select the candidate they wanted. And so we, after the election, sat down and said, well, we need to take a closer look at what's going on here. We had other reports around the state and started this comprehensive review statewide of voting equipment issues. And so it's the first time we've done something like that. I think it was very eye-opening for not for me, but for everybody else in the state. And so the win vote issue actually wasn't the primary reason we started this review, but came out of the review as we started looking at some of the issues flagged in the system or that were documented on election day. The reviewer that we had went out and we linked the issue to the wireless connectivity in the system. We actually worked with our state IT agency to do additional analysis and review, and the findings were pretty disturbing as to how easy it was at this point to be able to get into that system. I think it's a reflection of the larger issue that we're kind of grappling with in terms of certification. Neil mentioned certification, not being able to make changes to systems once they're certified, but the system we were dealing with in terms of the win vote was certified 10 years prior. If a system's secure when you certify it, that doesn't necessarily mean it's secure 10 years from that. The types of changes in wireless connectivity, Windows operating system, all those issues have changed so drastically in that time frame that we need to be looking at how can we make changes to these systems? How can we upgrade them? How can we do periodic reviews to make sure equipment is still that we should still be using it and fielding it in elections? I mean, I think there's a lot of great work going on around looking at next generation standards for voting equipment and kind of figuring out how to do some of that. I know we've been working with our state IT agency to figure out vulnerability testing issues. There's a lot. A lot that goes into kind of figuring this issue out.
But meanwhile, you have these jurisdictions that need to get new equipment like immediately,
and
right?
We had some folks that had to turn around, in about 9 weeks, field new equipment for a primary election. I will say they were all successful in doing that, and we actually, in the June primary election, we didn't get any report. It was not a statewide primary, but we didn't receive any reports of voting equipment issues in the June primary. And so we have, heading into November, we have there were about 20% of the state that had to switch because we decertified their equipment. There's a lot of other localities like Virginia Beach who experienced those issues last year and are like, that is enough for us. We are getting new equipment in place and we're doing that now. But we have localities around the state, some that cannot afford to make that investment, and so we'll be continuing to use the equipment they have.
So Larry, can you talk a little bit more about why are we facing this issue now? I mean, obviously, some election officials have known about this for a while, for years. I mean, it's kind of coming to a head now, but it's not a complete surprise. Why has not more been done?
I think this goes to a bigger problem with the way we treat elections in the United States, and that we don't fund them. It basically is what it comes down to. It's not a priority in our budgets. Generally, we only pay attention to them when there are problems. And Edgardo made this point, and we quoted him in the report. You wouldn't treat the fire department this way. You wouldn't wait until the wheels came off of the fire truck to think about replacing it. You wouldn't wait until you got the 911 call and realized that you didn't have a fire truck to send out. And unfortunately, we don't plan and budget for elections in that way. And one point I wanted to make about what Neil is doing in Orange County is so impressive. But Orange County is a huge county, and it has huge resources. I mentioned it's the 5th largest jurisdiction, and it's also a very wealthy county. One of the things that was very troubling to us, and we were hearing from election officials, and Edgardo made this point as well, is, when you don't have funding from the federal government and when state governments are refusing to fund their elections, what ends up happening is the counties with resources replace their systems when they need to be replaced. And I think you mentioned Fairfax and Loudoun County had done that very recently. And the counties that don't have the resources don't. And where we were able to run the numbers, we found that was borne out. So after Edgardo said that to us, we went and looked, and fortunately we had pretty good data on Virginia. The average median income of counties at that time that had recently purchased equipment in Virginia was about $70,000. For those that hadn't, it was about $50,000. And particularly smaller, poorer, more rural counties were left using equipment that is more likely to break down. We saw the same thing in Minnesota, where we had pretty good data and we were able to run the numbers. And we saw the same thing in Ohio. The County Election Officials Association gave us a survey that they had done for counties recently. And many counties said they needed new equipment, either before this election or very soon after. Very few of them said they could afford to buy them. And those that could afford, I mean, it's not really all that surprising, but those that could afford had a much higher average median income than those that didn't.
I actually probably would take exception to one thing that you said, which is that we wouldn't do this with the fire department. But having covered government for many years, I mean, I honestly do think that many things don't get funded until there is an emergency. And I guess that's my question for you, Doug. What do you think it's going to take for this issue to get the attention that local election officials in general feel it requires?
Well, local governments and state governments One, they get tired of hearing the word crisis because they've heard it from every quarter of every group of every person or organization or part of government that needs funding. And so in this particular case, we may not yet be in a crisis, because a crisis is when people actually act. You know, they actually then go to the point. Election 2000, right. We had a crisis. Finally, the nation, you know, spent some money on it. U.S. government up to that point had never spent a dime on elections, and then after election 2000 spent $4 billion, you know, just shy of $4 billion to try to work on this. And so we're in sort of that death spiral, you know, and you can warn about that, but people don't see it as real until it happens. You know, your car's not functioning well, you know, so you may have to put new brakes on, you know. That's sort of the thing that we're doing. You know, look at from the standpoint of the issue that we talk about now. Probably far more people watched CNN last night and talking about the personality conflicts between candidates than they are the real world situation of putting democracy at risk. You know, can we actually hold an election that will help us select both within the parties, both on the Republican side and the Democratic side? And will we be able to then, when we get to the general election, to go through where there is not one instance of a situation where it creates a confusion as to who actually won the election? And that's kind of where you get to it. And when you're an election official, the last thing you ever want to think about is that your voting equipment doesn't work well. Now, the problem is elections officials, because they want to have confidence, they want the public to have confidence in the system, elections officials are not going to get out and beat the drum and go out publicly and say, oh my God, the sky is falling, or that my election equipment's no darn good. They're not going to do that. They may say it privately. They may tell county commissioners privately. They may say it orally, but most of them are not going to the newspaper and saying we got a problem. So when you look at this, I mean, that's probably one of the reasons that over the years, you know, they had guys like me who could come in and say, you know, county commission doesn't hire me, and so I can say to you, county commission, you're in trouble if you don't do something here. We've sort of got the ostrich theory in government, you know. We're going to hide our head in the sand on any given problem, and particularly voting equipment, because all they can see is that voting equipment is used a few times a year to hold some elections, and it's really expensive to replace it. And so it's one of those where you look at the whole contingent of the thing. Here's what I think we're going to need to do. Those of you that live in Washington, D.C., the Pope is going to be here next week. Those of you that are going to get to talk to the Pope, ask him to pray for us, you know, if you will. I mean, because he obviously has an end, you know, and so we're probably going to need that. I mean, the two things that any election official in America prays about is, one, that the voting equipment doesn't cause a problem, and secondly, that the election's not close. You know, I mean, that's just our natural deal. But so when you look at, for those that have had equipment in 20 years, and some of them out there have had for 20 years, Windows 3.1 in 1995 was the operating system, and Windows 95 was introduced in August of 1995. In 2002, we had 500 million PCs in use. How many of those are still in use at home or business from 2002? Almost none, you know. And yet in voting equipment, we're continuing to rely on this stuff. In 2005, that's just 10 years ago, Windows Vista was the operating system. My lands, we gave that stuff up. That was really bad stuff. We gave that stuff up a long time ago. And yet this is kind of what we're going through. And so the unfortunate thing is to solve the problem costs money. It's not cheap. It's expensive. But I'm going to tell you, after watching Election 2000, it's a whole lot less expensive than letting it blow up on you, because then the money's unlimited. You know, when you've got a major crisis on your hand, all of a sudden everybody wants to point fingers and, oh, by the way, we've got an open checkbook. Fix it, you know.
Edgardo, actually, you've confronted this issue already in Virginia. The governor, Terry McAuliffe, asked the state legislature, as I recall, for $28 million this year to buy equipment statewide, but that was rejected by the legislature. So I'm curious, I mean, do you, one, sort of what kind of issues has that presented you with? But also, I mean, do you think it's going to take, quite frankly, some big disaster? I mean, Virginia's a pretty important state in the upcoming elections to actually get some action on this.
Yeah, and so I think what Doug said in terms of people's experience with, you know, they see equipment field a couple times a year. It's not till it affects them. I can tell you that the day after the election, I had to go up to the governor's office, and he says I was trying to press. He says I was pressing the button, and I couldn't get it to select the person. And there's all these. He's the governor, so there's all these cameras there. He says, what are we gonna do? I don't want to have that happen again. What are you gonna do to fix it? And I said, well, I can't, you know, our equipment's old. The only thing we can do is replace the equipment, you know, and so he took on the initiative of putting this out there and taking this on as an issue, as what we were hoping was going to be a bipartisan issue, and held a press conference in Virginia Beach with Representative Ridgel, you know, to talk about funding equipment. Ultimately, you know, then there was a lot of good discussion in the legislature about it, but ultimately, you know, the message that came out of the legislature was this is a local responsibility, and they will have to fund it locally. And so we go back to this issue. You know, elections are really a core function of government. They're a core governmental function. We should be properly funding them, and, you know, Election day and voting is supposed to be kind of this equalizing moment, right, in the community where everybody, regardless of kind of where you are, you know, in terms of socioeconomic status, able to have voice in the democracy. I think what we're seeing in terms of this local responsibility is that those communities that can't afford it are having a negative voting experience. Those that can are having a positive voting experience. So, you know, that is a big issue for us. And you know, we do need to, you know, Doug mentioned I know there's not a lot of my colleagues that are willing to go out and, you know, talk to the public about it. But I was, when we had the wind vote issue, I went in person because I had the IT folks call and they said, well, we were able to do this, so I don't believe you. I'm going to go and see this because it is so, having fielded that equipment in a local election when I was a registrar, it was just so problematic for me to think that this is what our citizens are voting on. This is what they're using to cast their votes. So, you know, we have been making you know, putting a big focus on this. I think it's not, you know, in terms of funding, Doug mentioned the billions of dollars from the federal government. Our agency, our state agency, roughly 60% of what we're spending in a given year is still those federal dollars. We're quickly running out of that money. And so, you know, in the next 2 to 3 years here, we're going to be short 60% of our agency budget at the state level to be able to properly administer elections and meet all these requirements related to statewide databases and all this other technology. And so we need to be, you know, I think it's important to go out there and talk about it because we need appropriate funding to be able to do this and to be able to ensure that people have confidence in the elections process. And we do have very close elections in Virginia. So I want our voters to have confidence that at the end of the day, whatever the result is, they are confident that was the will of the people and those were the results.
The problem, Pam, is I don't think the federal government's going to pony up any more money. No. You know, this is always before election 2000. All elections in America were funded principally by local governments and then in some cases by state governments, either enhancing or enriching or in a couple of cases where state governments took over some of these functions. After the result of the Help America Vote Act, obviously states were given a great deal more responsibility, and so they have taken on more funding as a result of getting money from the federal government. The question is will that continue once we go into the point of where it's now going to be a state and local function again. And the problem with statewide systems is that it's then horribly expensive to make a change, and legislatures get, where they want to bow their back. And so it's, look, I've been around this stuff a long time. I'm the old guy in the room. I'm darn near old enough to be a poll worker. And so,
There was a groan there.
yeah, well, yeah, and so this is one of those where you see behavior patterns over a period of time, and we've been trying to say this long enough through the Election Center, through my efforts, through training seminars. We've tried to say it through NASED. We've said it through NACO. We've worked with the National Association of Counties to start getting the message they need to build this into their budgets. And it has to get to the point that it's part of their funding cycle. And they have not yet gotten used to that idea, that it's part of their funding cycle. And there are two reasons for this. Old equipment used to last forever. When we had lever machines, which, by the way, had no way to verify that anybody voted the way they did on lever machines, and we used those for 90 years, 90 cotton-picking years. A lot of those jurisdictions had systems that they had bought 50 and 60 years earlier and were fixing them. When we had punch cards lasted on average 35, 40 years. Now this stuff that we're buying in terms of both optical scan and direct recording equipment, they're lucky if the life cycle is 12 years. I mean, at 12 years, you better start planning to replace it. And you don't want to replace. I mean, the last thing any election official in America wants to do is replace voting equipment in a presidential election year. Scares them to death. Right. I mean, there's just too many people out there. And so this is kind of what we're looking at. And until we find a way to solve this, I don't think Congress, at least the current makeup of Congress, tells me that's not going to be a source of funds. And so where we are is local governments are going to have to pick this up.
So Neil, I was wondering if you could weigh in here. What are the things that are preventing Orange County from upgrading its equipment at this point?
Well, I mean, we've been planning, Pam, for the past 5 years in our strategic financial planning for replacing it. We know that we did our analysis on our system, and I don't want to field it again in 18. So we have a reserve fund that we've been setting aside. Larry made the point that Orange County is a wealthy county. That's true. But when it comes to the county government, I mean, if you remember in '94, we were the first large municipal bankruptcy in the country. So we're still feeling the pain of that. And so it's not an easy solution to set aside the funds. I do want to address one thing that Doug said. I like Doug a lot. But he's talking about, election officials don't want to go out and make this an issue. I think that I'm negligent if I don't. I'm not a big fan of tombstone regulation. I don't want to be in front of cameras explaining why I didn't go through this process. We've surveyed just in the last year 5,000 voters here in Orange County as we plan for our new system. And at the top of their list of what they want in a system is accuracy and reliability. And by the way, that was ahead of privacy and ease of use. So the voters are very clear about what they want in a system, and they want it to be working and working properly. So I don't want to be the one putting my head in the sand. And I think, and if I could just really speak briefly on behalf of my fellow election officials, it's not all about budgets. I mean, there are other things you can do outside of just money to make sure that your system is going to have a reduced amount of risk when you do field it. And I believe that very strongly.
Could you just give us some examples of some of those things?
Sure. Analyze the current system. If you have to do with your current staff, do that. Identify the failure rates on individual components. You can do that. That data should be fairly easy to pull. Source parts that are not a part of the voting system certification. Just a quick example of that, and I'm really in the weeds here, Pam, but the components on the legs of our booths, the manufacturers stopped making them. So we had to find another source to be able to stamp those parts, to be able to replace them and make sure they're working properly. Inventory parts when you can. There are some parts that you can gobble up, and we're doing that now And if your budget is limited, there's certain components that you should invest in ahead of others because they may have a higher failure rate. And then finally, conduct detailed testing and maintenance. I mean, maintenance can be conducted with your current staff, and it doesn't have to be a huge maintenance plan, but it can be a maintenance plan based on your current resources. So those are just some examples right out of the gate.
So Larry, we've talked a little bit about voter confidence here, and you know, as a voter, should I be worried about what's going to happen next year? I mean, are we talking about basically just inconvenience for election administrators? Are we talking about long lines? Are we talking about actual votes being lost? What do you think the realistic impact is of this aging equipment?
Yeah. So I've been asked a lot in the past couple of days, you know, where is the big failure going to happen and how bad is it going to be? And you know, if I knew that, I'd probably have a different job. Look, I think this is a serious problem. I think there's a lot that can be done, as Neil said, to make sure that whatever problems there are minimized next November, for instance, because as Doug said, in most places we're not going to replace all of our equipment before 2016, and it probably wouldn't be a good idea to try. But you know, in the wrong circumstances, I'm very concerned. Charles Stewart and Stephen Ansalabaher from Harvard and MIT. I think I just reversed their schools. They might not be happy about that. But from MIT and Harvard, found that in 2012, between 500 and 700,000 votes were lost because of long lines. If we don't replace equipment, those kinds of problems are going to get worse. It's just unavoidable. As equipment ages, you have more failures. And you know, we have a number of examples in that report, some of them Edgardo talked about, but around the country where machines just have to be taken out of service because of various failures. And when you do that, you're going to create long lines. So, you know, what is that going to mean for the 2016 election? Well, if we have an election like we had in 2000, it's certainly going to get a lot of attention, and there are going to be a lot of people talking about, as much as who won and who lost the election, how our system failed us. I should say, I think, you know, we do have a federal agency that is meant to help with these issues. And we actually have some people here from the Election Assistance Commission. I think that they have a role here to help local jurisdictions. Everything Neil said is true about what can be done. I think it's always more difficult for a smaller jurisdiction with less resources to do things like figure out where the problems have been and to replace parts. And I think and to ensure that they know what kinds of problems come with their machines as they age. And I think the EAC has a role to play in making sure that election officials are aware, even if a jurisdiction hasn't had a particular problem yet with their system, what kinds of problems other jurisdictions have seen as those same machines have aged. And I should say the EAC just came out with a pretty good document about maintaining older equipment and how best to do that. And I think, you know, obviously engaging in best practices, knowing what kind of pre-election testing is best to find problems before they happen, knowing what kind of poll worker training they should be doing for contingency planning when there are failures, knowing what kind of post-election audits are best to catch problems. All those things are things that can minimize the impact. But the short answer is, you know, if we have a close election, these problems are going to look a lot worse.
And I'm glad you noted that we do have a couple of EAC commissioners here, and I hope we'll turn this over to questions from the audience shortly, so hopefully you guys will chime in. But before we do, one question I was hoping the panelists could answer, and I don't know who wants to answer this, just from my perspective, having covered this for a while, my sense was that when election officials purchased equipment after the 2000 elections, they were pretty much beholden to the vendors, that they really didn't know. I mean, everything happened very quickly. This was all new equipment. A lot of election officials really had no clue how this stuff worked. Obviously, they were often not told how it worked by the vendors. I wonder how much you feel like that, we're paying the price for that now, and has that changed as we're basically ready to head into a new wave of purchases? Or am I totally wrong?
I've worked with this for a very long time, both on the aspect of when I served as executive director of NASED. We obviously started the first testing program and qualification program. NASED, National Association of State Election Directors. This is the state employees who are in charge of making sure that elections come together and that what they do and how to enforce stuff and how to look at stuff and set up the rules and regulations for it. And so NASED started the first testing program simply because nobody else was doing it. The federal government had looked at it and decided they didn't want to do it, and so NASED took it on. And so all I'm saying to you is that from 1994 forward, we've worked on these issues. And the dependence on vendors, at least after election 2000 and the Help America Vote Act getting passed in 2002, was simply because a lot of them did not know and did not have experience with. Your larger jurisdictions tend to have technical people and therefore learn and become self-sufficient fairly quickly. Part of that is out of self-defense. They don't want to be beholden to somebody else for something they can't explain if it's coming through the system. Part of it is simply because then if they can become independent of the vendor, then they can actually control their costs better, and they can assure what they're doing with it. But there's a whole level of administration out there in terms of medium-sized counties and small counties that truly do not have the technical expertise. We've been trying, I've spent the last 10 years trying to get legislatures to understand that they need to build this capacity at the state level to have technical support at the state level, regardless of what the voting system is, so that you can give some assistance to those local jurisdictions. It's expensive. Technical personnel are expensive, technical training's expensive, technical proficiency is expensive, and so states don't want to do it. So then we tried to talk to local governments about the largest jurisdictions, then helping the smaller jurisdictions or medium-sized jurisdictions, because they've got the technical expertise and the technical people, and do some cost sharing there. And in a couple of instances, I think that's worked. I think in talking with Commissioner Masterson of the EAC this morning, he was saying that Sedgwick County, Kansas has gone out with another 8 counties, and so together they're working to fund the technical side of this to sort of make this work. And so those are examples that we need to look at and need to work on. But reliance on the vendors has gotten to the point that, and look, we're not the only system of government that does this. I mean, there are lots of government offices that get very close with their vendors and have to rely on their vendors to do things for them because they don't have the expertise on their level. But this is one where truly we can't be independent of the vendors in many instances in America because there's not enough staff or training or expertise in order to do some of these.
But Edgardo, do you want to weigh in on this? I mean, do you feel like, as the state election commissioner, that you really have a good grasp of where the state needs to go as far as the equipment, or is this something that you do have to rely? I mean, obviously on the win votes, you guys relied on the vendor that it was not, going to be hackable.
Well, and in the case of the win, the vendor had actually gone out of business, so it was not, so there was no vendor. So I think Doug is right. I mean, we have localities in the state that they don't. They're part-time part of the year. We have certain registrars in the state that are part-time and so they are the only person in the office. You know, I go to some of the offices in smaller localities, and it's, you know, the offices are you know, not much bigger than a small closet, and so they don't have the resources to hire technical expertise to be able to do appropriate logic and accuracy testing, to be able to do that. So there is some dependence on the vendors. I do think that as we have this discussion of, you know, moving forward, the discussion, I think it's been happening. And I'm glad the EAC has been, you know, they've appointed commissioners again, because I think the conversation at the national level has been going on, and there's a focus on, you know, long term, how do we avoid being here another 10 to 12 years? And so, you know, looking at different options that allow localities to have equipment that they can swap out parts, and they're not, you know, they're not tied to just one vendor. You know, there's projects going on looking at open source solutions. There's projects, you know, some of which were cited in the report, where localities are looking at kind of building their own system. You know, there's all these potential options out there, looking at, you know, common data formats and off-the-shelf components. We need to be looking at all that and you know, working together to kind of get a workable solution. Because yes, if we just you know, I talked a lot about, you know, trying to get money from the legislature and from local governments, but if they're just pumping in money to do the same thing they did the last go around, we're gonna be here again another decade, talk about the same thing. What happened? What went wrong? Why aren't we prepared for this? And so we need to be looking at a more global view about how we, you know, get new equipment that's going to be that we can upgrade more easily, that's more maintainable long term, that we can you know, put in resources up front now, but maybe the long term cost isn't so bad.
Pam, can I just,
yes.
I was just going to add briefly to that. I agree with what Edgardo and Doug have been saying, and also, you know, let's not forget that this is a business, and what we're seeing, I'm seeing in the state here in California, that a lot of vendors are focusing their efforts on, you know, like you said, what's next. They're putting their money and their R&D and their technology into new products, because they do see that wave coming forward. So that's why we have been self-sustaining here in Orange County, mainly for that reason, because we need to invest the money and the time to do it, because they are focused on other things.
So I would like to, I'd like to take maybe some questions from the audience at this point. Is there, oh, and we have mics, and if you could just say your name and, you know, if you have an affiliation.
John, no affiliation, just interest. Why hasn't anyone brought up going back to paper ballot? I mean, a lot of major, not corporations, but countries, Canada, Austria, other ones, I can't think of them, have gone back to paper ballots because of the cluster, whatever we have now, heading down the road. I guess they saw something we didn't. I don't know. It doesn't make any sense that a country this large and important and industrialized is in this situation. It's absurd.
Larry, do you want to take that?
Sure. I mean, Doug, I know Doug wanted to say something. I'll let him go first.
Well, look, the problem, we can do paper ballots in New Hampshire and in Vermont, you know. We can't do.
They are still in some places in Massachusetts.
Yeah, you know, we can't do only paper ballots in our major urban centers around America. We would not know the answer to who won the election for months on end if that were the case. I mean, if we were going paper ballots hand counted, which is what some have proposed, is not an easy solution, or even probably right now a workable solution. So we have to use technology, and technology, quite frankly, at least when we're talking about what we have seen so far in voting equipment, technology is far more accurate than humans. And so it's been one of those where that's why we do it.
Of course, we have, in fact, seen a pretty major shift in recent years in which a lot of, especially the direct recording equipment, the touchscreen machines in many states have been replaced by paper ballots that are optically scanned, which addresses some of that issue.
I mean, specifically on that issue, I think something that's interesting, and this is, I mean, one of the things that I don't want to sound Pollyannish, but I think it is worth pointing out that new technology potentially has a lot of benefits, and hopefully, we've learned a lot. I mean, it is really incredible when you think about the fact that these machines that we are using now were bought years before the iPhone existed or the iPad, that have much better user interfaces. My point was going to be that, you know, there has always been some concern with these electronic voting machines that you can't trust totals, and what if, you know, there are concerns about what if somebody hacks into the system, what if there are software bugs, how do you know that they're actually accurate? And I do think that that there have been advances in technology that will make it much easier to use the paper records that we have now to check the software and to ensure that totals are accurate. So that is, you know, as we transition to new technology, I do think that is one real. There are many benefits, but that is one potential benefit.
Okay, but can you just? I mean, you raise a really interesting question, because at the same time, right. Well, what do you?
So I can tell you, you know, paper ballots also aren't cheap. I mean, we have localities, for instance, Fairfax County. I know you know, they have scanning equipment, you know, and the ballots they got printed for this upcoming election, and we're talking about close to $100,000 for ballot printing, and so, you know, every kind of system has kind of its costs associated with it, and it's kind of balancing those needs. I think it is also, you know, is not realistic in localities like Neil's in Orange County, I know Fairfax, and some of the other large localities. It is not realistic to expect hand counting to happen after the election. I mean, it's just an incredible task that would have to, and the amount of people resources that would be needed, and like Doug mentioned, it is not as accurate.
I just wanted a fact that I remember Dean Logan in Los Angeles telling me that that in some years they have 300 separate contests in Los Angeles County. So, you know, that's a lot more complicated to count than a single contest, obviously, that you might have in some European countries.
It's interesting because, you know, as I say, you raise an interesting question, because a lot of people do want to have the security of knowing that there's this paper ballot. But at the same time, from what I understand, and maybe Neil or Edgardo, you can weigh in on what you've been hearing, I also get a sense that a lot of voters say, hey, why can't I have a little tablet? Why can't I use my iPhone to vote? You know, especially younger voters, they just don't understand. So you kind of have this conflict between people wanting this convenience, the ease, but they also want the security. And what kind of challenges does that mean for you?
That's a really good.
Yeah, Neil?
I was just going to say that's a really good point, Pam, because in our surveys that we've been doing on looking at a new system, the acceptability of touchscreen and devices like that has changed so much over the last 10 years. People are comfortable with it now. They're looking for that. And in fact, we don't have a touchscreen. We have a screen, but you have to turn a wheel. Everybody that goes into the polling place is touching the screen now because that's what they're used to. So we're definitely seeing that shift here in Orange County.
Yeah, where they scroll up with their fingers and don't understand why the ballot's not moving.
Exactly.
What I think all the states want, Pam, because they've talked about it. I mean, the state directors have talked about it a good deal, that they'd like to see that next generation be independent of a certain technology and be software driven. And yet, at the same time, we don't yet have, we've got some folks that are in for testing, but we don't yet have one of those technology independent softwares approved through the federal testing program. And so, and trying to find out where the problems with that are. I mean, what you hope is that we can get to the point that you could buy a laptop or an iPad or whatever and use that to vote on. But then you've got to find out and test it to make sure it actually does all the things it's supposed to do when it works with the software. And so these are some of the problems. This is the kind of stuff that Tom Hicks and Matt Masterson and the United States Election Assistance Commission are working on. This is the reason we're glad they're back in business, is so that they can do these kinds of things. And Pam, one of the things that is just frustrating is that the federal government, the United States federal government, has got an agency that is a bipartisan agency to look at election administration in America and to work on the very thing we're talking about. One of their principal deals is on technology, and we don't fund it worth a flip. We spend about 7%, 7 cents per actual voter. If you take the 133 million that voted in the largest presidential election, which I think was 2008, who actually went to the polls, we're spending, their budget is about 7 cents per voter. And yet every year through USAID, we'll spend $700 million on developing democracies. This is kind of one of the problems that we have when we're looking at all this.
Actually, I was wondering, Matt or Tom, if you'd like to kind of weigh in on this, or you both want to weigh in. Exactly.
I promised you I wouldn't say anything, so. Yeah, I failed miserably. I made it through one question.
You'll get a rebuttal. You'll get rebuttal time.
No, he and I will agree. I almost guarantee it.
Could you introduce? Yes.
Yeah, I'm Matt Masterson. I'm a commissioner with the Election Assistance Commission. I appreciate this conversation, and we obviously talked with the Brennan Center in the midst of this because the EAC, we got reconstituted. We went 4 years without commissioners, and then in January of this year, we were reconstituted with a quorum of commissioners, and the first thing we started tackling is this very issue. And so we have worked very, very hard to create resources around supporting the older systems now and then purchasing new systems. So just some examples, we worked with Neil and a couple other election officials on a publication about how to maintain the older equipment, the steps that Neil talked about, even just evaluating memory cards and batteries and things like that, because I'm the optimist. My fellow commissioners like to make fun of me because I really believe this can be dealt with and managed because election officials are resourceful. They just got to know where to look and what to do. And so we've got a variety of publications up on our website about what steps you can take to maintain the systems, the steps you can take to put out new requests for purchases on new voting systems so that conversation around the vendors changes, because those RFPs and purchasing new systems, that's the leverage election officials have. And so as election officials become more educated on what they want out of the systems and what they can require of the vendors, that powers back to the election officials to get the systems they want. And then the only caution I'd add, or the conversation around tablets and pads, my perspective is skewed. I have a 4-year-old and a 2-year-old at home. And my 4-year-old and 2-year-old, when they go to vote, will not understand a piece of paper being handed to them. It's not going to, they don't know what to do with a magazine, but they know what to do with my iPad. And so we as election officials are aware of this because we hear it and see it. And so there is very real challenges for election officials on integrating new technology and thinking like IT managers. And so one of my passions in the EAC's goals is to work with election officials to get them thinking and providing resources around thinking like an IT manager, like Neil Kelly's doing in Orange County. And so we have resources up now of what have election officials done to think like IT managers, pre-election testing, all of that. And so our goal is to get out to everywhere we can, share this information, and work with the Neil Kellys and the Edgardo Cortezes and all these great election officials to get to the medium and small counties to improve this process. And honestly, 2016 is going to be fine because election officials are preparing now, and they just need the information on the steps they can take to do it, and they'll be fine.
Tom, rebuttal. And actually, Tom, if you don't mind, I honestly really want you, also if you can kind of address, should voters be worried?
I'm Tom Hicks, Vice Chair of the Election Assistance Commission, and I agree with a lot of what Commissioner Masterson said. I think that voters should be concerned. I don't necessarily think worried. I think that there should always be some sort of concern in terms of making sure that your votes are counted accurately and making sure that you are able to cast your votes without any sort of restrictions at all. 3 of the 6 mandates in HAVA directly address disability voting. And so when you talk about machines, that's one of the things that we will ensure that we definitely look at. We just recently had a technical guidelines development committee meeting in July, and we're going to hold another one in December. And one of the things that we are looking from the public is that we will get input from them on how we should develop our new voting system guidelines. And that's a way for folks to weigh in. I think that looking at machines is incredibly great. But there are some states, like Doug was saying, that just don't use machines like that. Like, for instance, Washington State, Oregon, and Colorado all vote by mail. So we have to continually look at how can they go into 2016 and make sure that their votes are counted accurately as well, because those are probably counted on tabulators. And also making sure that we don't forget about the military, because they're not really caring about what sort of machines are back here when they're casting votes in foxholes. So, so we are looking at different ways to develop to deliver ballots, but also to receive ballots in what those states allow. So, in going on with Commissioner Masterson was saying about his children. My children aren't learning cursive in school anymore. So when people want to go back to paper ballots and signing that, how are they doing their signatures? So these are things that the EAC, and I'm glad that we're back up and running, to look at, to make sure that we look at all aspects of elections, from poll worker training to ballot design to ensuring that the disabled can vote and have those votes counted accurately, but also making sure that those machines are functioning well. So,
is there any sense of like what's the timing for when you're going to come out with your guidelines?
So this is where we're going to disagree.
Oh, okay.
No, it's a great question, and I'll give you a less than great response, but as soon as possible, and that's why we just started the process. It's a public working group process in which anyone is invited to participate in helping us. And the goal here is to address what you've heard from both Neil and Edgardo, which is the certification process shouldn't lock them down. They should have the ability to make adjustments and make improvements. And the way you do that is write the standards at a level that allows for innovation instead of stifling it, and allows for adjustments on the election while still maintaining the integrity of the process. And so the goal here is to write standards and then do testing at a level that allows folks to improve the systems as we go, so that if an iPad does come out, it can be used in elections as opposed to having to sit for 10 years waiting to utilize that kind of technology. And so, my hope is to have it done quickly, but standards writing is not a fast process. But we think we've created efficiencies by bringing people in on the front end to weigh in on writing these standards instead of these long comment periods on the back end that never end.
So does that mean zip disks are out?
Yeah. Flash drives. No, that's not any better.
Actually, can we? Is there another? Thank you very much. Yes, sir.
Hi there. My name is Nathan Hort, and I'm with Follow My Vote. We're a company here in Virginia that's building online verifiable voting software. And of course, building this stuff, we're very concerned with a number of things, but chief among them are security, which includes end-to-end verifiability and availability, just being able to cast your vote. And another one is scalability. As many of you are pointing out, we're seeing it's just not really viable to go back to paper at this point, because the sheer scale of the work of tabulating those votes is too great. So what we're seeing is that we are on the very cusp of having viable, practical technology to do a lot of the things that I've been hearing mentioned up here: voting on your iPhone, voting
Do you have a question?
online. And my question is, what we're seeing is the greatest barrier to that is legislative. And so my question is, how long do you think it's going to be before we can get the legislation and the standards written to a point where we can create an online system that fits those requirements.
So does somebody want to take that question?
Well, I would just say my first concern would be making sure that we have security advances that would make internet voting safe. And from everything that I know, we're not there yet. From the National Institute of Standards and Technology looking at this, from comments from folks at the Department of Homeland Security, from most of the computer scientists that we spoke to, there's great concern about it. So I would say we need to get past that hurdle before we are thinking about legislation to allow it.
The second part of that is you're dealing with politicians. If you can predict when they're going to come up with a solidified answer that makes all of them happy. Look, politicians don't like to change anything that got them elected. And so when they don't know whether or not they can get elected under anything that's new, it is very difficult to get them to actually move in any direction. And so, and then add to it Larry's response here, until we can figure out ways to do this safely and securely, it's always a problem.
Actually, Neil, I was just curious, since you're in California, are you getting a lot of pressure to look at online voting at all?
No, and I'll pass on the question.
Okay, got it. Edgardo, do you have anything to? No, okay, yeah, Edgardo passes too. Yes.
I'm Andrew Craig from the Justice Integrity Project, and my question is really for someone who knows about the Brennan methodology for the study. It's an independent watchdog organization, and the general theme, obviously, is that old technology is bad. We need new technology and how to fund it. And I think, clearly that's a huge issue. But some of the concern from the audience is, what if bad people are trying to manipulate the system in some way? So my question would be, did the Brennan Center bring in any whistleblower types or sophisticated technical people who understand how voting tabulation can be manipulated to incorporate those kinds of fears into the studies?
I can probably talk about our methodology, and so can Chris, but we certainly did speak to a lot of computer scientists and independent experts who have worked on the issue of ensuring that our elections are verifiable and that they have integrity. And that, if you, I don't know if we have copies of the report here, but if you take a look, you'll certainly see that we spoke to people like David Jefferson, who's at Lawrence Livermore, who's done a lot of work in the space, like Ron Rivest at MIT, and Barbara Simons, who's a former president of the Association of Computer Machinery. And Chris, am I forgetting other folks that we spoke to? This has always been a concern. The Brennan Center is certainly very concerned about the integrity of our elections, and I don't know that there's necessarily that we intended to have a premise that new is. I don't think we started out with the assumption that new is better than old, but we certainly had a lot of evidence from talking to folks that as this equipment ages, there are lots of problems with it.
Actually, I'd like to ask the panelists and whoever wants to chime in, please chime in. And is there any example of a jurisdiction that you see that's really handling this problem very well, that's addressing it well, or has the ability to address it well, that could be a model for other jurisdictions?
I don't want to monopolize this, but I do want to say quickly, one of the places that we profile is Los Angeles County, and Edgardo, I think, made some mention of what they're doing there, and there are other examples. Los Angeles has a lot of resources, but they spent a couple of years reaching out to stakeholders in the county, working with voters to essentially develop their own system. I think a lot of people are very impressed with what they've come out so far. My understanding is they're hoping to use open source software with their equipment, and that should allow them to own the equipment, to make changes to the equipment without having to rely on vendors, and using the best of technology to ensure that it's as user-friendly as possible for voters. Obviously, Los Angeles is a big and very diverse county, and ensuring that people from all kinds of backgrounds can use those machines is really important. I think what they've done there is very impressive.
We have a question back there. Before you ask, did anybody else want to address that?
Well, I think the question is, let me go back and say, nobody yet has figured out and actually brought to the fore something that is different from those things that we've seen up to this point. I mean, certainly Los Angeles is working on that, but Los Angeles is also working with some pretty old technology right now. So we've got a number of jurisdictions and a number of vending companies that would like to bring newer technologies and yet are encountering enormous resistance in getting there or finding ways to deliver some of these ideas. And so this is going to be the age-old part of this. The politics of election are that technology changes move slowly within elections, and adoption and acceptance of those technology changes move slowly. And so my guess is that isn't going to change before I kick the bucket. And so, that's just kind of where we are.
And of course, the big problem is while technology changes slowly in elections, in the real world, it changes very, very quickly, right? Anyway, another question? And if you could identify yourself, please.
Hi, I'm Juan Gilbert. I'm a professor at the University of Florida. And I wanted to answer that question as well. We've created a software system called Prime 3. It's a universal design. Some of you are familiar with it. And we will release that software as open source on September 28th. Complete open source. Anybody can use it, modify it. The state of New Hampshire, to answer your question, used it in the last election cycle in midterms. And they're looking to go statewide. We're working with them now on open source software. So we'll have a report coming out to show the cost savings, which were significant by using open source, and then going on a state contract with Dell Computers to get tablets and do it themselves. So we'll have a report on that next year after the election cycle, probably. But there will be open source in the marketplace for anyone to use on September 28th.
Did you have okay.
Dr. Gilbert worked through the United States Election Assistance Commission and through a grant from the United States Election Assistance Commission to work on some of these for accessibility issues. As a result of some of the things that Juan and his crew worked on, some of the vendors have already made massive changes in their technology and their software and so on, based on some of the things that Juan and his crew found. And so some of this has got, we don't know where it's going yet, but some of this has got some real potential.
And actually, Neil, did you have a question or no? Okay, thanks. And Neil?
Yes.
You're still with us. I'm just curious. One thing I have heard election officials say or people talk about is that, we talk a lot about money and the cost of replacing all this equipment, but that in fact it might be more cost efficient to get some of this new equipment or off-the-shelf equipment than it did, 10 years ago when you were replacing every single machine. Is that something that you see, looking forward, that in fact there could be a lot of cost savings here, or that there could be a lot more economical system to replace what you have now?
Absolutely, you're right on point. In fact, we're banking on that. When you look at the technology of 10 years ago for us, the county invested $50 million in the system, and I suspect that based on our analysis, we'll probably be spending half of that money because of improvements in technology and reductions in cost in that regard. So yes, absolutely, you're right.
Can you just give me an example, or give us an example of like what type of thing that you're talking about that would be less expensive?
Yeah, so I'm not endorsing any product, but there are technologies potentially that, for instance, in a polling place, we operate 1,300 polling places in Orange County. Well, right now I have to field 8, 10, 12 booths to each of those polling places. And in a new system, I could potentially field one device that could be a ballot on demand system, and 8 cardboard voting booths. And so when you look at that and you see the amount of reduction in cost, not only from a logistics standpoint in delivering equipment and storing equipment, but in purchasing that equipment. So that's a very specific example.
Yes.
Hi, I'm Karen Narasaki, and I work with the State Infrastructure Fund, which is based at Neo Philanthropy, and we're funding a lot of groups who are trying to work on both voting rights and election modernization. You had mentioned that there's disparity that you've seen in terms of counties and the income of the populations and which counties are able to upgrade and which are struggling. I'm wondering if you looked at that from the lens of race, because in 2012, the feeling was that a lot of the longest lines were in the communities where there were larger minority populations.
Actually, maybe Eduardo, you could address it first and then you.
Yeah, sure. I can try. I mean, so in Virginia, we actually don't keep statistics on our voters by race. But I can tell you, I mean, it is a I mean, you look at the map and you look at where the communities are, and I mean, there are pockets of communities there that are in those poor localities, but we also have some rural localities that have very low minority population. So it's kind of all over the board in Virginia, and I think it has to do more with kind of the changes in Virginia's economy over the past couple of years, and the shift and the places in the state that are struggling right now. And the reductions in federal spending that are impacting Virginia, not just in terms of elections, but overall. So we have a really changing economy in Virginia, and so you look at the map, and it's kind of all over the place in terms of places that are struggling.
Right, because actually the wealthier communities are the Northern Virginia ones that are actually very ethnically diverse. Yeah, it's kind of interesting. Yeah. How about you, Larry?
So, yeah, I mean, unfortunately, we didn't have as much information as we would have liked to do that kind of analysis, and we kind of had to work with what we have. But there have been some studies on this, not necessarily related to voting machine problems, but related to long lines, and Charles Stewart has done some of this work, and there are others. And I think what they found is consistent with what you're suggesting, that certain communities, and particularly communities of color, have at least in 2012, experienced longer lines than others.
Well, let me take it back from, if you actually go back and deconstruct, because as elections administrators, I'm going to tell you, we've always been concerned whenever an allegation like this is made. We have found some pockets in some locations where the data would match that theory. We have also discovered that in some other places where the lines were longest and people waited the most, that was not true. And so when you get into this, it's anecdotal evidence is not data. It's data is where does it actually happen and when is it happening? We've got enough of a mixed bag here that we need to look at it. But I'm going to tell you, elections officials don't sit down and say, okay, I've got limited dollars. I'm going to cut off a certain part of the population in order to do this. We're going to allocate resources to the wealthy districts and not to the poorer districts. That just doesn't happen. You can't stay in your job as an election official if you do that sort of thing. What you do have more often than not is limited resources and limited ability to recover when something unusual happens. You cannot just go to the local Best Buy and buy a whole bunch of new equipment and press it into service when you find you've got a problem on election day. And so this is one of those that sometimes the problem shows up. Now, is that our fault? Yes. In some cases, I think elections officials who have not looked at demographic shifts, who have not looked at who might come out in greater numbers given who's on the ballot, or the issues that are on the ballot, then in those cases, I think we have to look in the mirror and accept responsibility for not doing thorough enough planning. But more often than not, you're looking at resource constraints being something that it takes us a while to catch up and fix.
Although it does raise a really interesting question. If, you know, we were all talking about the possibility that there could be a crisis, you know, and if it emerges in poorer districts, you know, that's going to raise some serious questions about election results and the fairness of elections, which obviously is something that voters, you know, are very concerned about.
I do want to echo what Edgardo was saying, though, is that because we were looking on county by county, in Ohio, in Minnesota, in Virginia, the wealthier counties that were buying were often suburban and urban counties that had more diverse populations, and smaller rural counties were often not. So we just don't, I'm being quite honest, we don't have enough information. All we have is the correlation of average median income that we looked in those 3 states. But it's not clear to me that it falls one way or another in that on that question.
I mean, it sounds like something that a lot more work's going to have to be done on this, that there's not. Do we have any? Yes.
Hi, my name's Emma Borbor. I'm with US PIRG. We're a Federation of State Public Interest Advocacy Organizations. And I'm wondering, aside from waiting for a crisis and then jumping on that opportunity, what advocacy organizations can do. And I'm particularly interested in hearing from the election officials what we can do to amplify the problems that you have and the stories that you're telling. And but then aside from that example, what can we do before a crisis?
So, Neil, do you want to take that one?
Yeah, I'd just like to address that. We've been engaging in California, or particularly in Orange County, with advocacy groups. CalPIRG is one of them, Common Cause, several others, that have been very helpful in engaging with voters on issues and trying to figure out turnout for specific areas of the community and changes in demographics and turnout. That's been very helpful. I think for smaller jurisdictions, that would be also really helpful, because that could be a way that you allocate your resources and your equipment. And that's just one example of what we've been doing here in California.
Edgardo.
Yeah, so I think in Virginia, we at the state level have a very good relationship with a lot of the advocacy organizations in the state, and have worked with them on a number of issues, particularly focusing on outreach, because when we look at trying to get information out to voters, a lot of these organizations are in the community and are working with populations that we may not necessarily have the resources to reach. So we have had a very good relationship, getting information to them, making sure they have materials and things that they need to do that sort of outreach. I know a lot of our local registrars work with local advocacy organizations to make sure that they are going out to events in the community, making voter registration and ID production services and those sorts of things available to the communities that need it. So.
I was wondering specifically what we can do to help to fix this infrastructure problem, or it seems like maybe there's an opportunity to advocate for more funding, but how do you think we should go about doing that?
Again, I think that the advocacy organizations, they do a lot of advocacy in state legislatures too. And so when you're out there doing that advocacy, having the conversation with legislators about, properly funding not just state agencies, but the local agencies, and making sure that the resource needs are met, and what are the implications, for them if they don't. I think one of the big things, during the last legislative session is we didn't get everything we requested, particularly not the funding for voting equipment, but we did get other resources. And I think from a election official perspective is at least putting the information out there and giving it to the policymakers so they know, okay, here are your choices. If you don't do X, Y, and Z, here's the potential repercussions of it. And I think the advocacy organizations can play a big role in helping to echo that message and really bring it home with the folks that they are closest with.
Pam, can I add to that?
Oh, Neil, what?
I was just going to say thank you for that follow-up question too, because I think that really directs where I was thinking in terms of what we're doing in California. The future of California of elections here in California is a group of statewide advocacy groups that came together and formed about 2 years ago to work together to focus on issues like election funding mandates. And so that's one great way that you could help, because that's been very helpful here in California.
Thanks, Neil.
And I think, look, 76%, 77% of the voters are in about 25 to 30% of the counties. Urban counties obviously tend to be where you see more of the issues, because some urban counties are wealthy, some struggle to have government meet all the good competing needs that are out there for everything. The more you all can do to work together to go through some of this, work with also your state election association, those elections officials, to find out what is most useful and most helpful. What is it that they need in terms of resources? If you're an election administrator in most parts of America, you're in a resource-starved profession. 25% of our jurisdictions are probably funded as well as any other part of government. But that means 75% are not. And so when you look at this, there's always going to be trade-offs of what you can do. In fact, we got to the point when we were going through the economic crisis, we got to the point where a lot of these local governments were telling the elections office to cut their budgets by 20 and 25%. My suggestion to them was put a map on the wall and ask them what 25% of the voters they didn't want to vote. You know, I mean, holy cow! This is, this is exactly what, this is exactly where we are. So, I think Neil's suggestion of getting together as a coalition of groups first, and then meet with your state association of elections officials, those local elections officials, to sit down and say, what is it you need most and how can we help you most?
Okay. And I think we can have time for one more question. Who's had their hand up the most? Sorry, I didn't. Oh, sorry.
I'm Brian Dugan. I'm with the Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights Under Law. I think there's been a lot of discussion about confidence and verifiability, and it's obvious that that many counties have been placing a demand for openness, for vendor independence, and some of that is met by the demand for open source software, which is great that there's obviously been this shift. But in order to have there's also been a discussion of end-to-end verifiability, which open source software only gets you part of the way. In order to complete that picture, you need a complete open hardware system. And within this room, there's been discussion of voting on iPads, voting over the internet, which involves many, many black boxes.
And can you are you asking a question?
I'm curious what the demand is for open verifiable hardware that is distributable and people can verify, because you can crack open a lever machine and verify that it works. When will I be able to open up my local voting machine and verify that it's the hardware that the schematic says?
Okay, who wants to take that?
You will have as much gray hair as I have before you get there.
So be able to verify a United States election.
Do you want to take this?
I mean, I don't, I think there are other ways to verify other than just the hardware. I know in Virginia, we have a shift back towards scanning equipment and paper ballots. So we have another record there that you can look at and compare results. We have ability to do post-election audits. I mean, there are other ways to get at that verifiability issue that doesn't involve kind of developing our own hardware. And we're talking about resource constraints, and there are some of these things that just aren't feasible in the resource environment that we have. But there's other ways to address the particular issues.
I would say, just to follow up on that, I don't know if our report has arrived, but in the report we do discuss this this development of risk limiting audits that Philip Stark has developed, and how that with a fairly small amount of resources, you can really confirm to a high degree of confidence that vote totals from the machines are correct.
And I think, aside from my flippant answer to you at first, is look, the reason we have a United States Election Assistance Commission working with the National Institute of Standards under a system of development of standards to look at all of this and test all of this is to have trusted organizations looking at this. Not every group in America is going to be able to crack these open and ask their own questions. Somewhere in here, we got to trust somebody to do this for us. That's usually the function that government itself has provided. It's one of the reasons that the United States Election Assistance Commission has been so important in this, and their testing process and their laboratory process and the VISTLs that are out there now, these agencies that actually test this stuff are very good, and they ask lots of questions and they go into great depth. And so I think at some point you have to get to a trusted source.
Sorry, did you want to say something?
Yeah, just really quick. This won't fulfill your answer you completely, but in fact, we don't just certify the system. Sorry. I always assume I'm loud enough. Yeah. That's what my mom says too. We don't just certify the system, but in fact, we follow up. And so in Ohio, when I was in Ohio, I worked with the EAC to actually go out and field audit the systems to make sure they're in the configuration, including hardware configuration, that the system was certified in, to verify that, in fact, Ohio was fielding the certified equipment. And where we found it wasn't, we worked with the vendor to mitigate that. And so it doesn't completely mitigate your concerns, but all of our testing documentation is open. All of the configurations for the systems are up on our website and available. And then we'll work with states and counties to actually go test the systems out in the field to make sure they're configured in that way. And then election officials have, like was mentioned, post-election audit processes to follow up on that as well. So, I mean, there's, like anything with security, there's levels of security, right?
Okay, just actually this woman, if we have, is your question fast?
I was going to comment, so I'll pass.
Okay. Well, I think we're actually coming up to the end here, and I just want to thank our panelists so much. Neil, thank you so much for coming from... and Doug, and Edgardo, and of course Larry. So anyway, and thank you all for coming.